So Trump tweets out, for a very long time, buying and owning a home was considered the pinnacle of the American dream. It was the reward for working hard and doing the right thing. But now, because of the record high inflation caused by Joe Biden and the Democrats in Congress, that American dream is increasingly out of reach for far too many people, especially younger Americans. It is for that reason and much more that I am immediately taking steps to ban large institutional investors from buying more single family homes, and I will be calling on Congress to codify it. People live in homes, not corporations. I will discuss this topic, including further housing and affordability proposals and more, at my speech in Davos in 2 weeks. So, Trump tweets this out, and I wanted to take a look at the data today around just how many homes these institutional investors that he's referring to own, and kind of some of the implications that could come about on if something like this were to truly be codified into law. What could this look like? What would be the different scenarios? How does this impact if you are looking to purchase property in 2026? And also be on the flip side of it, if you're selling property in 2026, I think implications are there too. What I did was I jumped over into Claude and I had it source 337 sources across the internet to pull information and data around how many institutional owners own property and kind of some of the information around these institutional organizations and just what their impact is in the housing market. Starting it from the top here, Claude is pointing out that just 1 to 2% of America's single family housing stock nationally is attributed to these large institutional buyers. Now, one of the things that I wanted to, clarify right off the bat is what are we defining as a institutional investor, right? If we look at the American Enterprise Institutions definition, that threshold is just 100 homes. Or are we looking at the institutions that are owning at least 1,000 or more single family homes? Those are the mega investor standards. Those are your institutions like Blackstone, American Homes for Rent, those type of organizations. Those are the folks that are the what we're going to consider the mega institutional investors, right? And if I have to imagine, those are going to be some of the folks that are going to be caught on the hook here. Now, I just want to mention it references that they own just 1 to 2% of America's single family housing stock. If I actually go to the article here that it's sourced, this is from the Government Accountability Office. They released a report. This is in 2024, so this isn't brand new as of 2025. We're now in 2026, but I think the information is still going to be applicable here. That there were about, according to studies, no single investor owned more than 1,000 single family homes prior to 2011. However, by 2015, institutional owners invest between 170,000 and 300,000 homes. By 2022, there were 32 institutional investors collectively who owned 450,000 single family homes. And according to the Government Accountability Office, the five largest investors owned nearly 300,000. So basically, what we're getting at here is that this is a newer phenomenon in the sense that prior to 2011, this institutional body did not gulp up the housing inventory like it has over the past decade. So I thought that that was interesting and applicable. Some of the things that we're going to get into as well, I'd like to talk about it from a national perspective and then kind of get more local to where I am in the Cincinnati and Dayton area. One of the things to consider, it's referencing Claude was pulling that same data from this article as well, around that 1 to 2% number of single family homes across the US. Just a couple of things that were interesting too. Some of the hotspots of where these folks are concentrated in, the Government Accountability Office estimates that institutional investors own 25% of Atlanta's single family rental housing market, 21% of Jacksonville's, 18% of Charlotte, North Carolina's, and 15% of Tampa Bay, Florida's. So those are the biggest pockets of where these institutional investors are buying property. I would love to hear if you are in one of those areas or have ever lived there, if you have had experience with some of these large institutional rental owners. And I would just be very curious to hear what your experience was with them. But something to come back to our report here, if I come down here a little bit further in the report and some of the data and information in specifically my Cincinnati area, we have about 2.5 times higher than the national average as far as institutional ownership of rental property in our area. So we're estimating that in the Cincinnati area, approximately 5% of citywide rentals are institutionally owned, the largest being Vinebrook Homes. I personally have experience with these folks in buying some of the property that they've been liquidating over the past few years. They are the worst to work with. They are more bureaucratic than working with the bank, and that is saying something. But this report also mentions here that they own over 3,000 properties in the Hamilton County area within the city limits. And in West Price Hill alone, they own a concentrated amount of 271 single family homes, which is about 6% of that neighborhood's rental stock. And in some instances, they actually own 20% of the properties on some streets. So I'm very familiar with these Vinebrook home folks. I'm aware of also the lawsuit that they had in January of 2023. That was my first introduction to them. And then they did have a settlement in 2024. If you know of anyone here, if you're here local and you know anything about the background, I would love to know more. I was trying to find out what the background and the context was around those lawsuits. But I think just in that context alone, that's something to consider, right? These folks that are institutionally owning these properties, they're not doing a great job of call upkeeping in the community, right? If the city of Cincinnati and these cities are having to take legal action against them, they're not the greatest property owners to begin with anyway, right? But something I want to jump back to here is the concept of, if you heard me talking about they own just 1 to 2% of the properties, we always hear this number being flown around. Well, what are these 20% or 25% numbers that are being floated around there around the concept of just how many properties investors own? I think that's kind of where I find this interesting and might need some clarity around just exactly we're going to take as far as next steps from a government perspective. Because if you take a look at it here, from a share of what type of investor owns the property, the biggest subset of folks are, that mom and pop investor, the folks that own between 1 to 5 properties. That's 85% of the investor call it population or makeup here in the US. And then, 5% of those are folks that own 6 to 10 properties. About 8% are between 10 and 99, but it's only about that 1, maybe 2% that own several hundred, if not more than 1,000 homes. So, one of the things that I would be very interested on is how exactly are we going to define who an institutional investor is, but also what are we proposing as far as, are we just saying that going forward, these folks can no longer purchase property? Or are we saying that these folks can no longer purchase property and that's where we're leaving it? Or are we truly saying that these folks have to divest their stock and their inventory, so to speak? Because I, being free market capitalist, have reservations around the concept of forcing an institution to divest something that they own as a corporation. But to the same token, if these folks do own a huge chunk of properties, that could, in theory, although I would have very serious reservations and would want to see exactly logistically what this looks like. But the idea being that if, for example, let's use Vinebrook Homes here in our Cincinnati market, if they had to divest 3,000 properties in and around our area, that would be a huge amount of supply that would be a huge supply injection into our market, right? And if something like this ever happens, I would like to be the person that they call because I will help you in getting all 3,000 of those things sold. But in any case, that's just something very important that we're going to have to define, right? Are we just going to put a ban on the further acquisition of these properties, which is probably still a step in the right direction? But do we, on the flip side, have to have a conversation around these companies divesting from their inventory that they have currently. I would be very curious to hear what your thoughts are around this. I was actually very surprised to see that the call it minor amount as far as percentage inventory that they own, but to the same token, that even if they own just 1 to 2%, that's still a huge stake. When you consider the macro U.S. housing supply, if they own even just that percentage, that's no small chunk of change. So I would be very curious to see what the next steps are from the proposal from the government on this. But ultimately, if you drop a comment, let me know what you think or shoot me over an email. I would be very interested to kind of engage with you on what your thoughts are when you heard this news. Do you think this is a great thing? Do you think that this is something to be concerned about because this is government overreach? Let me know what your thoughts are. Otherwise, if I can be of help and service to you in navigating the Cincinnati and Dayton, Ohio real estate markets, I would love to be a resource for you. And the best way to contact me in that capacity would be to email me there. And that would be the best place to get a hold of me. And I sincerely look forward to seeing you on the next one. Talk soon. God bless.